What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content that I'm uploading onto my channel, then feel free to subscribe, and you can also offer suggestions on topics and characters and storylines and whatnot that we can have discussions on later on in this channel.
Okay, so in DC Rebirth, New Superman is actually a really cool comic. It's one of these comics that DC releases where it's just designed to be fun. Like, I mean, it has an ongoing story, and this is really all kind of serving as tie into multiplicity with the main DC comic Superman. But New Superman's just fun. I mean, it's just a fun comic. It feels like what Super Sons will be. It feels like what Teen Titans already is. You know, it's just a fun comic that focuses on a new superhero. That's one of the things that I like about this so much, is because it's kind of DC going out in left field. So in a lot of ways, this comic really feels like it's in its own continuity, like it's in its own world. I mean, it shares the rest of the DC Rebirth continuity, but it feels like it's kind of in its own world. And so what we do here is we initially pick up with a young guy who's really kind of referred to as like Fat Boy by Kenan Kong. But the funny thing about this is that even Kenan himself basically talks about how he was more or less a bully. Like that's really what he was. Now, the basis behind him picking on this young man will come to fruition later on. But in terms of how he's depicted here, he's really just kind of a dick, is really what it is. You know, but the funny thing about this is that while he is picking on this young guy, the young boy is suddenly set upon by Blue Condor. Now, what we're told by Kenan is that Blue Condor is one of a handful of new villains that have popped up in China that are kind of mimicking Western villains. And that's kind of the interesting thing here, is a lot of this really has to do with the idea of, you know, Chinese-Western relationships, which is to say how China views itself in comparison to the West as far as superheroes go, which is why I see a lot of this is kind of in its own little continuity. But the cool thing is that Kenan basically steps up to Blue Condor as foolish, but he steps up to him, you know, and more or less kind of chases Blue Condor off to a degree. Now, of course, Blue Condor was here for the purpose of grabbing this young guy, grabbing, you know, Lixon, as far as we're aware. But, you know, with Kenan chasing him off, it's just kind of like, well, everybody thinks he's a hero now. Everybody thinks he's a pretty solid guy. Now, the funny thing about this is that we're also met with the arrival of a girl named Laney Lan. And again, she's basically a stand-in for Lois Lane. And that's why I say it's kind of its own Chinese counterpart, because we're basically going to see these Chinese versions of a lot of the characters that we're familiar with, which is why it's kind of this give and take. But Laney Lan is basically tied into Primetime Shanghai, which is kind of like their Daily Planet. But the cool thing here is his actions as far as his interview with Lan is all being monitored by a woman by the name of Dr. Omen. Now, this is not to be confused with Lilith Clay. They are not the same person. Dr. Omen is a wholly separate individual. Lilith Clay as Omen is a wholly separate individual. They're not intrinsically the same thing. But again, Lan being here is really just for the purpose of DC kind of beefing up the character of Kenan as he exists here, in the sense that Kenan kind of races off to talk to his dad, and he runs into, you know, his dad being a mechanic, runs into his dad, and his dad's kind of like, you know, well, that's cool, you're on TV, I saw you fighting off against Blue Condor, whatever, there are more important things to worry about. And this is kind of presenting this dichotomy between father and son, in the sense that, you know, Kenan is kind of like, hey, look, I could have died here, but I stood up to a villain that could have killed me. I thought you would be proud. And his father's, you know, response is truth, justice, and democracy. Those are things that are greater than yourself. There are more things that his father's worrying about than Kenan himself. Now, we'll find out exactly what this is, but it creates an interesting situation, because usually when it comes to superheroes of some kind, there's always a parental aspect to what goes on to those superheroes. With Spider-Man, it was the death of Uncle Ben, basically the closest thing he had to a father. With Superman, it was the loss of his parents with Krypton's destruction. With Batman, it was the loss of his parents at the hands of Joe Chill. It's almost always the same way. There's always parental aspects of superheroes that help to ground them, to help to make them more realistic, because for us as people, there's something visceral about losing our parents. There's something significant about that, and it changes us in a way that we don't really consider until it happens. It's one of these weird things where, like, you know it's coming later on down the line, but nothing ever preps you for it. With regards to Kenan himself, this kind of, you know, disconnect between him and his father is a situation where he basically aims to make his father happy. That's really what this is, as being a driving force behind making his father proud. And so what happens is he's approached by Dr. Omen, and Dr. Omen says, we would love to offer you an opportunity to be something great. And she even presents him with video evidence of Superman being a hero. And she says, how would you like to be China's Superman? Well, like any high school kid, he's just like, yeah, I know I would. If somebody came to me and said, hey, Rob, would you like to have the powers of Superman? I would be like, show me where to sign. It'd be really fun. And that's exactly what happens here. You know, of course, he's basically hooked up to a machine, and he's kind of given Superman's powers to a degree. Now, with regards to the character of Dr. Omen and how they do this, a lot of this really really goes back to the last days of Superman, right? I mean, that was the whole story arc that dealt with basically the death of the New 52 Superman. And what we found out during that whole series of events is that with the emergence of Superman's, or I guess New 52 Superman's new solar power, that individuals are basically jockeying for position to try to grab a little piece of the pie, to try to find some way to duplicate Superman, especially when they kind of become aware of the fact that he was essentially dying. And so because of this, Dr. Omen had basically been snatching little pieces of his DNA here and there for the purpose of creating a duplicate. And new Superman, Kenan, basically seems to be that duplicate to a degree. Now, we're going to find a little glimpse here. We'll get a little glimpse later on down the line where it's actually Kenan that he's not really the first duplicate. There were attempts to make another Superman before him. But what he's receiving basically is the ability to tap in to Superman's solar energy. Now, there's a huge difference here. When it came to Lois Lane and when it came to Lana Lang, their abilities to tap into the power of Superman was because they were basically imbued with it naturally, in the sense that the powers essentially just kind of flowed into their bodies and they were able to just kind of use it on their own. It was like being Superman for the very first time. Lana Lang was teaching the New 52 Lois Lane how to be Superwoman, how to learn how to fly, how to use heat vision, or how to use her super strength, how to pull her punches when she needs to, and how to use full strength when she needs to. With Kenan, it's similar to this, but the issue here is like it's almost as if he's tapping into an external source. So he's not really imbued with Superman's powers. He is to a degree, but he's learning how to harness them. Now, the other half of this is that where he begins to kind of experiment with his abilities, sort of test the waters, he's met with the arrival of Chinese Batman and Chinese Wonder Woman. And that's the cool thing here, is because we basically get like the Chinese Justice League. And it's actually really cool. It seems kind of hokey at first, but the relationship between these characters in terms of how they deal with one another is actually really fun because they're all essentially teenagers here. And it's really, really cool. It's like getting, the Teen Titans, if the Teen Titans were DC's Justice League. It's really cool to kind of see it unfold. But of course, he's basically attacked by a combination of Batman and Wonder Woman, and it's really just kind of giving him a better idea of where his powers stand, of what it is that he's capable of doing. Now, of course, once he's basically kind of corralled, once he's brought back down to earth, once we get a depiction of what it is that Chinese Wonder Woman and what it is that Chinese Batman are capable of, he's basically knocked out. Now, the kicker to this is that when he wakes up, he cannot tap into his powers. And this is essentially DC telling us that Kenan's powers come and go, that it's not like he was imbued with the abilities of Superman and now he can do everything. This is kind of a journey for his character in the sense that he's learning how his powers work, he's learning how they function, he's given kind of this inhibitor device that really keeps his powers at bay, but also serves the purpose of educating him about the Justice League. And the reason for this is because what Dr. Omen is doing, at least on the surface anyway, it seems like she's forming a Chinese version of the Justice League that can basically allow China to compete with the West. And the reason why is because with the exception of the Great 10, which is a group that we'll talk about here in a minute, they popped up as far as DC's 52 following Infinite Crisis. The whole idea was that China never really had a counterpart to the Justice League. Indeed, it was designed to be that way in DC. The Justice League of America, or even just the Justice League, was a worldwide team. Despite being called the Justice League of America, they were a worldwide team. It wasn't like the Justice League rested on their laurels and they sat in their watchtower and said, hey, look, if it's not attacking the United States, then we don't care. It's not like they did that. It's not like Staro would show up on Earth for the purpose of turning the entire whole of humanity into slaves. And the Justice League were just like, well, what? We're not worried until it touches down in North America or until in the United States. Then we'll worry about it. The Justice League was always an international team, but what China wants is to have their own variation of the Justice League. Now, in terms of why this is happening, this is going to be something that's kind of alluded to over the course of the story, but we won't find out per se. The only real indication that we're given here is that China wants to be able to compete with the United States when it comes to superheroes. And so it's really just kind of like this space race, so to speak. It's almost like this Cold War-esque situation where instead of the United States and Russia trying to make the most nukes and throwing astronauts into space and so on and so forth, it's basically the United States and China racing for superheroes. And so what we do is we pick up with Kenan's father. And again, he's part of a group that's really just designed for the purpose of standing up for, again, what he considers to be truth, justice, democracy. They're basically freedom fighters. And it's kind of a cool concept here because we're eventually going to see all these different things come to a head. But the first thing we do is we pick up with a woman by the name of Wei Li, or at least with Batman or Chinese Batman, Chinese Wonder Woman, and Kenan himself. We pick up with Wei Li. And what we find out is that Wei Li is basically being attacked by a character named Sunbeam. Now, the reason for why this is happening isn't made apparent. All we really know is that this is going to be a field mission, basically, for the Chinese Justice League. It's really just kind of testing the waters to see what the team is capable of when they work together as a cohesive unit. Now, once they arrive on location, because of the fact that Kenan still doesn't have his powers, he's just kind of made to watch. And the funny thing is Chinese Wonder Woman goes into the house, basically rescues the daughter from Sunbeam, brings her back out, and then makes Kenan sit with this little girl. Now, this is a nightmare for anybody because there's nothing worse than in my mind than like crying babies. Like crying babies are the absolute worst, mostly because of the fact that those aren't my babies that are crying, they're somebody else's. I imagine it's different when it's your kid, but the fact remains here, it's kind of one of these little, these funny little moments. But of course, Sunbeam races off with Wei Li for the purpose of basically killing her. Now, of course, Kenan jumps into the fray, and the reason why is because of the fact that this little girl crying reminds him of himself in the sense that his mother died when he was younger. She was basically killed in an airline accident, and the result is that when he was experiencing all this guilt, when he was experiencing all this remorse, this little girl is in the same boat where she stands to lose her mother. And so seeing himself in this little girl prompts Kenan to jump into the action. Now, because of all this, once he's in the action, he's basically shot by Sunbeam solar power energy, and then Kenan's powers just fly into overdrive. And so it's kind of cool because what's happening is we're getting this indication that solar power basically activates his powers or has something to do with how it is that he's able to function as a hero. Now, of course, Sunbeam's taken out quick, fast, and in a hurry. But the funny thing is that again, Lan shows up on the scene as a reporter and is like, hey, wow, like, I haven't seen you before, what's your whole deal? And then Kenan's like, well, you don't recognize me? And she's like, no. And he's like, well, it's me, Kenan Kong. I'm the new Superman. He throws his identity out for the world to see. And it's hilarious here because like we could imagine that happening with Clark Kent, right? I mean, you could see that happening, like Clark Kent, he's all in love with Lois Lane and everything, and then she meets Superman, he's like, well, what, you don't recognize me? She's like, no. And he puts on his glasses, he's like, it's me, Clark Kent. Like it'd be hilarious because it's the total opposite of what we saw in DC. I mean, when we had the New 52 Superman, we got Superman Truth. We got his identity being dumped out to the world by Lois Lane. It was done against his will. He didn't want anybody to know, and he basically, at the same time was losing a huge amount of his powers. And so it was kind of like the worst case scenario. Again, all that was leading to his death and the return of the pre-New 52 Superman. But here we have Kenan just divulging his identity publicly to the world. Now, the problem with this is that it creates an absolute nightmare because he's like, we're the Justice League of China. Like he's just he's just dumping his info out for the world to see. And it's funny because Lex Luthor's watching this, Batman, like the actual Batman, Bruce Wayne is watching this, the Great 10 is watching this, everybody is watching all this unfold. The Daily Planet is watching this, and they're like, well, China's got their own Justice League now. And what it does is it creates a really wild situation. And the reason for this is because of the fact that in the mind of Dr. Omen, she had intended to basically wait to broadcast the Chinese Justice League to the world to make their presence known. But with the world knowing that China has a Justice League, now no one knows how to act. No one knows how to respond to this. Should they trust the Chinese Justice League? Should they look at it with weary eyes? Is China going to use their Justice League to try to take over things? What's going to happen here? And the result is that once Sunbeam is basically taken prisoner in a place called the Shell Crab, which is just kind of like their underground or their underwater prison, Kenan is basically just blasted with a device that ends up nullifying his powers for a short amount of time. And so we pick up with Chinese Wonder Woman, and it's kind of funny because her and Batman are just kind of all sitting around having this conversation. They're coming closer together as friends, and they're like, why would you broadcast your identity out to the world? Why would you tell people who you are? Like, your anonymity is the only thing you really had that was safe. And that kind of shows us the reckless nature of teenagers, right? I mean, it shows us how reckless teenagers can be. And it's a side of this that we never really see. I mean, we'll never see that with Jonathan Kent because he was raised with the idea of how important anonymity is. When the pre-New 52 Superman, the pre-New 52 Lois Lane, and Jonathan Kent first showed up in the New 52, they had to stay hidden from the rest of the world because one of the first things they realized is that the New 52 universe, that Earth, did not trust superheroes. With regards to Superboy, Connor Kent, it was much the same way. He was basically surrounded by individuals who said you have to maintain your anonymity, but that was very much a focal point of his character. With regards to Kenan, there's no one telling him that. There's no one saying, I mean, there is to a degree, but it's an authority figure. Teenagers are rebellious by nature. And so when an authority figure comes along and says, you can't tell people who you are, well, when you're a teenager, you do the exact opposite. You tell everybody who you are. And so it creates a really funny situation because what they end up doing is they basically go off on their own. And the reason why is because they come to the realization that these attacks, the first attack being on the young kid that Kenan was bullying when Blue Condor showed up, the attack on Wei Li, they're systematic. It's basically government officials, or at least members that are tied into the government, being attacked in a particular order. And so Batman, Chinese Batman comes to the realization that the next person who's going to be attacked is a guy by the name of Xing Shikang, I guess. I apologize if I'm butchering that name. I'm not really familiar with Mandarin. I don't really know how to pronounce words in Mandarin properly. But what ends up happening is Chinese Batman, Chinese Wonder Woman, and Kenan basically race off. Again, they're essentially going rogue here. They're operating outside of their protocols. The problem is that when they get there, when they get to this location with with Mr. Zing that he believes that they're coming after him. He believes that they're the ones that are attacking him. Now, this attack coincides with, again, these freedom fighters of China. Now, the freedom fighters of China are the ones that are actually there to attack him. The issue with this is that as far as Mr. Zing's concerned, he doesn't know who to trust here. And so, of course, while he creates a distraction, he basically races off. Now, in the middle of all this, Kenan is attacked by a guy named Flying Dragon General. Now, to be honest, I could think of much better names. I could think of some much better names than Flying Dragon General, but I imagine a lot of these names also have extreme symbolism to the people who use them. And so, I guess it wouldn't really be fair to say these names suck, because within the context of, I imagine, Chinese society, those names are probably intrinsic. Or it may be that if you're in China watching this video, you're like, yeah, man, those names do kind of suck. So I have no idea if that's the case or not. I've never lived in China and I'm not wildly familiar with Chinese culture. But the cool thing about this is that, again, a lot of this is coming from the fact that Kenan doesn't really have his abilities. Instead, he's fighting off just being a normal person, and he's doing a pretty darn good job at handling himself. The issue with this is that as far as the fight goes, Kenan seems to be getting the upper edge to a degree. The issue here is that his upper edge is contextual based on Batman and Wonder Woman, I guess Chinese Batman and Chinese Wonder Woman, coming to his aid. And so it's really one of these instances where DC is just kind of building up the teamwork aspect of this, in the sense that they all basically have to work together. Now, Flying Dragon General is basically sent along his way, right? I mean, he basically just kind of bails out, realizing that it's a losing cause. And we pick back up at Dr. Omen's base of operations with Kenan and everybody that's there. But then we find that Lan is there along with them. And the reason why is because Kenan's actions of broadcasting his identity to the face of the world, telling them that Kenan and, Chinese Batman and Chinese Wonder Woman are all part of the Chinese Justice League, has drawn the attention of a lot of eyes. A lot of people want to know what's going on here. And so because of this, they're basically forced to kind of put on this official face. They're forced to put on this idea with Dr. Omen saying, hey, I'll answer any questions that you have, but if you have questions for these guys individually, then their answers are going to be short, sweet, and to the point. They're not going to divulge too much information. A lot of this is because she just doesn't trust Kenan because he's a teenager with the powers of Superman. I wouldn't trust him. I wouldn't trust myself if I was a teenager with the powers of Superman. But all of this sort of coincides with the arrival of a guy by the name of Paperman. That's really it. I mean, Folding Paperman, the reason why they call him that is because of the fact that he can basically modify his body like folding paper and get into areas where he wouldn't normally be able to get into. Now, of course, a lot of this comes by the way of Ghost Woman, who can kind of get in and out of areas without people detecting her, but having swallowed, Folding Paperman, she basically regurgitates him out. He takes his form and they engineer a breakout of Sunbeam and all the other freedom fighters that have been captured and held in this prison. And so because of this whole escape, this whole, violent, attempt to get away is basically the freedom fighters intending to use what's referred to as a genetically modified Staro. Now, this is something that we've never really talked about. We haven't really gotten into Staro too much. The reason why is because of the fact that Staro is just old hat. Staro was the very first villain that the Justice League fought when they were created in 1960. And so because of that, Staro just kind of has an ongoing legacy. Now, the legacy isn't like insane. I mean, Staro will crop up from time to time, but it's not like all of DC Rebirth is leading up to the return of Staro. It'd be nuts if it was, and I would read the hell out of that story, but it's not. Staro is basically an organism from beyond the planet Earth that could, control people's minds. What ended up happening here with the actions of Dr. Omen is that she had basically found a way to duplicate Staro, and this version of Staro is being taken by the freedom fighters of China. And so what we do is we pick up with Kenan when he arrives back home and finds out that his father is the Flying Dragon General, whatever his name is. And so because of that, it's basically Kenan and his father coming to terms on where the other stands. And this is when we learn the whole basis behind why his father is basically a vigilante here, and why it is that Kenan, really was picking on that young boy at the beginning of the story. The reason for this is because of the fact that in his youth, Kenan's father, of course, ran into his mother, and they began living under the regime of communist China. The issue with this is that as time progressed, while they couldn't vocally, go out and speak directly against the Chinese government for fear of just being tossed in jail as political prisoners, instead, they basically operated behind the scenes. They operated underground, and they began to form this sort of, this group that existed behind the scenes. Now, the larger their group became, the more they were willing to engage in open protest, but the risk was always there that they would be snatched up and they would be thrown into a prison. The problem with this is that as time progressed, their family began to grow. Kenan was born, and where Kenan's father wanted to back off and say, okay, look, it's time for us to stop. Things are getting too wild. Things are getting too dangerous. We have to take care of our family. Kenan's mother said, no, now we have even more of a reason to fight than we did before, because now we have to make sure the future is safe for our son. And so what ended up happening is between the time that his mother became very much a vigilante in the most physical sense, she ended up dying in a plane crash. And this is when his father says, the death of Kenan's mother was not an accident. When he started going through all these different things, it was not an accident. Instead, his mother had basically been murdered. His mother had been murdered by the Ministry of Self-Reliance, the very industry or the very group that Kenan works for at this moment as part of Justice League China. And so because of this, Kenan is basically faced with a debacle here. He's sitting across from his father, who is by all intents and purposes a villain, a vigilante. But at the same time, he also has to come to the realization, maybe there's some truth behind the statement that is when his father says, the Ministry of Self-Reliance, the people you work for, are the ones who engineered your mother's death. And so temporarily, he basically allies himself with his father and ends up joining the freedom fighters of China. Now, of course, this leads to a conflict. It leads with their escape. But then we find with Staro, again, with the activation of this genetically engineered or this genetically modified Staro, the uncle of Kenan begins attaching these different Staros to Chinese Batman, to Chinese Wonder Woman, so on and so forth. But this is a little too much for Kenan, because keep in mind, for him as a character, for Kenan as a character, righteousness is always the way to go. And that's one of the things that's great about his character, is because he's very much Clark Kent. He's very much Superman in this regard, in the sense that Superman will always do what's right, even if it means he's the last one standing. If it means he's standing in the face of Wonder Woman, of Batman, of Green Lantern, of all these different guys, he will still stand up for what he believes is right, unless we're talking about injustice. So because of this, it creates kind of a cool situation, because we see very much of the Clark Kent that we've come to know, the Superman that we've come to know, in the eyes and in the mind of Kenan. And this is why I say the whole concept of the parental dichotomy, young versus old, experienced versus inexperienced, wise versus reckless, this all has to do with the idea of how superheroes form. Because whether they intended to or not, the teachings of parents always rub off on their kids. And even though his father was a vigilante, even though his father was basically a bad guy acting of his own accord, and as his father basically watches the different members of the freedom fighters of China attack his son, at the end of the day, his son continued to adopt the very lessons that his father taught him, that you always have to stand up for what's right. And so again, with Kenan lacking his powers in the traditional sense, he's basically thrown into the water by the freedom fighters of China and left to drown. Now, of course, this leads to his father diving into the water and saving his son. And that's where things get kind of cool, because at the end of the day, it's a father and it's a son, and that's really all there is to it. And so with the freedom fighters of China, their goal is to essentially start an insurrection. It's basically giving people the ability to take their country back. Now, this is actually a really, really cool debate that takes place between Dr. Omen and the father of Kenan. And the reason why I say this is because of the fact that they basically have this philosophical argument. You have one person, you have Dr. Omen on the side of the government basically saying people can't govern themselves. And then you have, Kenan's father on the side of the people saying people should be allowed to govern themselves. They should be allowed to make mistakes. But it's kind of funny here, because it's always it's a circular pattern when it comes to governmental function, when it comes to how societies work. I want to say that it was the Roman historian Polybius, I guess the Greek philosopher that turned Roman historian, that always argued that it's always a vicious cycle. What starts out as democracy will eventually descend into mob rule, because people don't like how they're being treated by an existing government. Mob rule will turn into somebody rising up to basically take control, which will lead to a despot. A despot will lead to a king will lead to a monarchy will lead to an aristocracy, or lead to an oligarchy, or something along those lines. But it's always a circle. It always goes in circles. Everything comes back around. And so essentially what stance is being taken by Dr. Omen is, we're keeping this circle from coming back around again. People cannot be trusted to govern themselves, because when they do, they always descend into violence. And it's kind of a legitimate argument to make here, right? I mean, it's like humanity had its chance to govern itself. Humanity had its chance to make all the right decisions, and all it did was make all the wrong decisions. And so if humanity is not willing to govern itself accurately, then we'll govern humanity for humanity. We'll basically take away people's ability to govern themselves, and we'll make them live properly. There's a lot of philosophical arguments that go on here. Again, it's always that argument that I took of what use is freedom to a society that would use that freedom to destroy itself. And so because of that, we basically have Kenan and his father allying, if for no other reason than for right now, a plane has been hijacked by the freedom fighters of China with the intention of literally crashing it, starting an insurrection, bringing the entire system of governmental control in China crashing down. Now, of course, with regards to Kenan and his father getting there, Kenan's powers begin to come back to a degree, but again, it's this cool thing about him basically tapping into the powers that he has, because that was one of the huge discussions that he and Wonder Woman had, that when it came to Kenan, he was imbued with the abilities of Superman, but what he was doing is he had these psychological blocks that for whatever reason, he would lose faith in himself, or he would let his emotions govern his abilities. And so when he was in a state of emotion, this wall, this door would open and the powers would come flowing in. But if he was emotional again, or if he allowed himself to move away from rational thinking, this door would open up and the powers would go away. And so it was basically her saying, you've got to be able to control this door. You've got to be able to keep these powers going and keep them under control. And so what she says is, calm down, find your inner peace. And when that happens, you'll be able to tap into these abilities. And that's exactly what happens. Kenan begins to find his own measure of inner peace. And when he does, he basically starts to become Superman as we know him with regards to his various powers. Now, of course, at this point, it's really just like Kenan tearing things up. But at the same time, he also has to reconcile this with the fact that it's a plane full of people. So it's not like he can just grab this plane plane, tear it in two, and then just get rid of the freedom fighters of China. If he did that, he'd doom 200-300 souls to their deaths. And so because of that, he basically has to go against each of these members of the freedom fighters directly, which means that he basically is in a position where he can fall victim to these Staro, mind control devices. Now, of course, the cool thing is the first one he frees is Batman, is Chinese Batman. And in response to this, he basically modifies this little control device for the purpose of sending out this sort of pulse ray, this sort of pulse freeze. And what it does is it basically starts freezing off these different Staros, except for the main one. And so this main Staro is all part of the equation here and, kind of engaging in this whole conflict and so on. But the cool thing here is, or I guess the sad thing here is that in light of this major conflict, this attempt to basically save all these souls on board this plane, the uncle of Kenan attempts to kill him, again, attempts to basically obliterate him using a laser beam of sorts. The problem with this is that his father jumps in the way to save his son's life. And when that happens, the father of Kenan is essentially killed. And he says, look, if you learn no other thing, if you learn nothing else from this lesson that I'm teaching you, learn this. You have to find out who it was that killed your mom. You have to find out why, but you have to stand for truth, justice, and democracy. You have to stand up for what's right because people should be allowed to govern themselves. And that's ultimately DC saying that's the crux of the argument. That's the true stance to take: truth, justice, and democracy. An oppressive regime will try to maintain its oppressive nature as long as it can, but in the end, anybody that rules over a class of people is always terrified of that one person that will rise up and fight for the freedom of everybody else. And that's what Kenan represents. And even he, alongside Chinese Wonder Woman, Chinese Batman, say, look, we got to find who your mother's killer is. We have to find out who it was that issued that order. We have to find a way to bring them down. And when that happens, then we will finally appear as superheroes in the eyes of the West. We will finally be legitimate heroes in the eyes of the world. And so what we find out in this tail bit of the story is that within the Ministry of Self-Reliance, the body of Kenan's father has been taken by Dr. Omen. Not only that, we find out that with her compliance devices she had used to basically make him comply and fight alongside Kenan, that this device also serves as a purpose or as a way of keeping him alive. In addition to that, the way she refers to him as her love indicates to us that whether it's explained in a future story, in the next volume or later on down the line, it appears that either Dr. Omen had a relationship with Kenan's father or Dr. Omen is Kenan's mother. But with that being said, guys, if you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like. Again, I really like this story. I just wanted to kind of throw this out there to you guys, see what you guys think. I like it because it kind of comes out of left field. It's self-contained. It's in its own little universe. It doesn't really cross over with anybody else in DC. As far as I'm aware, Kenan crossing over with the main DC roster doesn't really happen until Multiplicity when he fights alongside the main Superman. But it's still kind of a cool little series of events. I really like how the story functions. But in any event, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end, and I will catch you all later. Peace.